There is a very specific, terrifying kind of silence that tells you your time might just be up, a heavy, suffocating blanket of absolute nothingness that replaces the gentle, rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the very machine keeping you tethered to this earth. And when my eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn gloom of my bedroom in Naperville, Illinois, that was exactly the silence that greeted me. It wasn't the benign quiet of a peaceful suburban morning in the meticulously manicured cul-de-sacs of the Whispering Pines Community Association, but rather the kind of sudden, dead-air stillness that precedes a devastating car crash or a jump scare in a psychological thriller, instantly causing my chest to tighten with a familiar, primal panic. This wasn't just the standard, everyday anxiety of waking up with a pair of severely compromised lungs that had essentially filed for early retirement, leaving me gasping like a beached fish on my bad days. No, this was the agonizing, razor-sharp constriction of a genuine red alert, a biological siren blaring in my brain as my body realized it was suddenly, desperately starved of oxygen. "All right, Arthur, just breathe, don't panic." I wheezed to myself in the dark, my voice already breaking into a dry, raspy scrape that sounded like sandpaper on concrete, desperately hoping that it was just a blown fuse, a tripped breaker, or perhaps a remarkably ambitious, deeply suicidal squirrel that had decided to chew through the neighborhood power grid. But as I dragged my frail body out of the warm comfort of my bed, every single deliberate inhalation requiring the kind of conscious, excruciatingly painful effort normally reserved for manually operating a rusted iron bellows, my eyes immediately locked onto the single, mocking, flashing green light on my medical oxygen concentrator's backup battery. That tiny blinking LED wasn't a beacon of hope. It was a cruel, ticking countdown, a taunting reminder that I had perhaps 2 hours of breathable air left before my lungs would completely fail me. And frankly, I hadn't felt a shred of genuine luck since my pulmonologist, Dr. Eris Thorne at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, sat me down 2 years ago, looked at me with the exact same pitying, sympathetic gaze you might give a terminal rescue dog, and handed down a sentence of severe, irreversible respiratory impairment, requiring full-time, round-the-clock oxygen therapy just to see another sunrise. Dragging my feet down the hallway, I fumbled frantically with the metal latch of the main electrical panel, running my trembling, clammy fingers over the rows of black switches, only to find every single one of them sitting perfectly, stubbornly in the on position, instantly shattering my hopeful little squirrel theory and replacing it with a creeping, ice-cold dread as my gaze drifted slowly toward the front window facing Cypress Court. Through the glass, illuminated by the pale, creeping light of the early morning, stood the true architect of my impending suffocation, Brenda Vance, the tyrannical, self-appointed dictator and reigning president of the Whispering Pines Community Association, a woman in her late 50s who carried herself with the haughty, untouchable arrogance of a monarch ruling over a deeply beige, vinyl-sided kingdom. She was out there on my lawn, sporting a rigid plastic sun visor that looked thick enough to deflect a police baton, clutching her ubiquitous, heavily tabbed leather clipboard to her chest, as if it were the sacred, unalterable constitution of suburban conformity. But it wasn't the clipboard that made my blood run entirely cold, freezing the marrow in my bones before flashing into a white-hot, terrified rage. It was the gleaming, heavy-duty, industrial-grade wire cutters gripped tightly in her right hand, glinting with a truly disturbing amount of righteous, malicious intent. She was standing directly beside my exterior utility meter, my absolute lifeline, the singular conduit of power standing between me and a very grim, gasping death. And before my oxygen-deprived brain could fully process the sheer, unadulterated lunacy of what I was witnessing, I was throwing my weight against the window glass, banging with weak, pathetic, desperate thuds that barely rattled the pane. I tried to scream, to unleash a booming, authoritative roar that would stop her in her tracks, but all that escaped my ruined lungs was a strangled, pitiful wheeze that sounded like a dying bird. "Brenda," I finally managed to croak, my throat burning as I unlatched the window and pushed it open, the cool morning air doing absolutely nothing to fill my desperate lungs. "What in the sweet, merciful name of God are you doing?" She didn't flinch, she didn't startle, and she certainly didn't look guilty. Instead, She slowly tilted her head up to look at me with the serene, almost psychopathic calmness of a religious zealot who firmly believes they are doing the Lord's work, projecting her voice across the dew-covered lawn with a sickeningly sweet, forced cheerfulness that made my stomach churn. "Good morning, Arthur," she sang out, casually gesturing with the lethal metal shears toward the small flower bed near my porch. "I am simply addressing a long-standing, heavily documented aesthetic infraction. There is absolutely nothing for you to concern yourself with, as your unauthorized lawn ornamentation, the gnome you insist on calling Barnaby, is currently encroaching on Eleanor Higgins's property line by a catastrophic margin of nearly half an inch, a direct, flagrant violation of Article 14, Section C of our community guidelines." She was talking about Barnaby, a harmless, deeply endearing, chubby little ceramic garden gnome holding a tiny painted lantern, a sweet, sentimental birthday gift picked out specifically for me by my 7-year-old granddaughter, Lily, a piece of painted clay that was about as visually offensive as a golden retriever puppy. "My gnome," I gasped, the sheer absurdity of the situation colliding violently with the absolute terror gripping my chest, desperately trying to draw a breath as the panic began to claw at my insides like a trapped animal. "Are you insane, Brenda? That is the direct power line to my life support, my medical equipment. I need that electricity to physically breathe. My lungs are failing, Brenda." But the woman merely offered a small, terrifyingly unsympathetic smirk, a cold, dead look in her eyes as she adjusted her grip on the shears, her voice dropping into a patronizing, bureaucratic drone. "Rules are rules, Arthur, and non-compliant decorative elements result in the immediate, temporary suspension of community amenities. Besides, I have received no less than 4 formal complaints that the constant, industrial humming of your little breathing apparatus is orally offensive and disrupting the natural, tranquil soundscape of Cypress Court." And then, in a moment of sheer, unbelievable, psychopathic audacity, she squeezed the handles of the heavy-duty cutters with a gleeful, decisive snip, completely severing the thick main electrical feed to my home. Inside the house, the faint, comforting hum of the refrigerator died, the hallway lights vanished, and the single green battery light on my oxygen unit switched instantly to a harsh, flashing amber, emitting a high-pitched, steady wail that signaled my imminent demise, while outside, Brenda Vance simply tucked the massive wire cutters into the pocket of her beige slacks, gave a smug, self-satisfied nod of a job well done, and turned on her heel to strut back to her perfectly manicured fortress, leaving me literally breathless, staring out the window in absolute, paralyzed shock. This was no longer a petty dispute over grass length or exterior paint colors. This was attempted murder disguised as neighborhood maintenance, a direct, violent assault on my life over a ceramic garden toy. My survival instincts kicked into overdrive as I stumbled backward, nearly collapsing as I blindly reached into the hall closet to drag out my massive, incredibly heavy, emergency steel oxygen cylinder, my hands shaking so violently I could barely secure the plastic cannula beneath my nose, weeping with sheer relief as the freezing, pressurized oxygen finally hissed into my burning airways. I grabbed my cell phone, my thumbs trembling as I dialed 911. Each desperate suck of air a terrifying reminder that this metal tank was a finite resource, only to be met by a maddeningly calm, dispassionate county dispatcher who listened to my frantic, wheezing pleas and essentially told me that unless someone was actively holding a weapon to my head in that exact moment, a utility dispute with an HOA president was a civil matter, offering to send a patrol car to take a report whenever one became available, casually suggesting I call the power company. I threw the phone onto the couch in a blind rage, the bitter taste of total, systemic abandonment in my mouth, knowing the power company could take days to dispatch an emergency crew, knowing the police saw this as a trivial squabble over hedges, and knowing that my tank would run dry long before the sun set. And then, as my tear-filled eyes scanned the coffee table, they landed on the massive, aggressively thick, spiral-bound Whispering Pines rulebook that Brenda had forcefully shoved into my mailbox months ago, and a tiny, brilliant, absolutely chaotic spark of inspiration flared up in the darkest, most desperate corner of my mind. If this woman wanted to weaponize the sacred texts of her petty bureaucratic regime, If she wanted to live and die by the absolute letter of the law to justify cutting my life support over a clay gnome, then I was going to turn that exact same book into an instrument of absolute, earth-shattering vengeance. Flipping frantically through the dense, legalese-filled pages of the rulebook, my hands shaking so badly I almost tore the paper, I finally found the exact, beautifully vague, deeply buried loophole I was looking for. An emergency addendum clearly stating that temporary, heavily motorized equipment is fully permitted for use during critical property preservation or severe medical emergencies. Brenda had just handed me a medical emergency on a silver platter, and I was about to exploit it with the kind of overwhelming, disproportionate force that would make military strategists weep with joy. I made 2 phone calls, the first to my doctor, Eris Thorne, who calmly but urgently instructed me on how to lower my flow rate to stretch my emergency tank for a few extra hours, her voice a lifeline of sanity in a morning that had completely lost its mind, and the second, a frantic, breathless Google search for industrial generator rental near me, leading me straight to Titan Power Solutions, a heavy equipment firm that boasted the tagline, "When you need enough juice to power a stadium." When a gruff, gravelly voice belonging to a man named Mac answered the phone, sounding like he chewed glass for breakfast, I didn't mince words, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, my breathing a ragged, mechanical hiss. "I need the biggest, loudest, most aggressively powerful generator you legally own, Mac." I wheezed, my voice trembling with a potent mix of exhaustion and vindictive fury. "Something that can power a hospital wing and make the ground shake, and I need it delivered to a residential cul-de-sac an hour ago." Mac didn't ask questions. He just let out a low, rumbling chuckle that sounded like rocks tumbling in a dryer, confirming he had a 40-ton, commercial-grade, diesel-guzzling behemoth fresh off a disaster relief gig, warning me that it was an absolute monster that drank fuel by the barrel and roared like a jet engine. "Bring it," I smiled, a dark, wicked grin spreading across my pale face, the sheer anticipation of the incoming chaos acting as its own kind of adrenaline-fueled oxygen. "Bring the monster to Cypress Court, because I have a life to save and a neighborhood tyrant to completely obliterate." Less than 45 minutes later, the tranquil, bird-chirping serenity of the cul-de-sac was violently, beautifully shattered by a deep, guttural, earth-trembling rumble that you could feel vibrating upward through the soles of your feet long before the vehicle even turned the corner. Neighbors who were peacefully sipping their morning coffees or watering their petunias froze, their heads swiveling in utter confusion as an absolute titan of modern machinery, a massive, 18-wheel flatbed truck hauling a piece of equipment so large it blotted out the sun, crawled majestically down the street, its air brakes hissing loudly as it came to a halt directly in front of my driveway. The generator, which I mentally dubbed Goliath, was a hulking, brutally utilitarian block of bright, industrial yellow metal, draped in thick black warning labels and massive exhaust stacks, looking less like a backup power source and more like a piece of military hardware designed for planetary invasion. Mac, a towering, broad-shouldered mountain of a man covered in grease stains, hopped out of the cab alongside his equally massive, silent partner, Tiny, taking one look at the severed power lines dangling from my house and the portable oxygen tank strapped to my side, and instantly grasped the grim reality of the situation without me having to say a word. "Where do you want her, boss?" Mac shouted over the deafening idle of the truck's massive engine, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the perfectly manicured, deeply sterile environment of the HOA. I pointed a trembling, defiant finger toward the pristine, beautifully leveled patch of concrete on my property line, sitting a mere 10 feet from Brenda Vance's incredibly cherished, award-winning rose garden, a spot that was technically mine but strategically placed to ensure maximum auditory and physical disruption to her precious sanctuary. As Mac and Tiny expertly maneuvered the massive crane, dropping the 40-ton yellow beast onto my driveway with a thunderous, concrete-cracking thud that physically shook the windows of the surrounding houses, I saw the front door of Brenda's house fly open, her jaw practically unhinging, her eyes bulging out of her head in sheer, unadulterated horror as her beloved aesthetic utopia was instantly defiled by a towering monument to industrial noise. With a theatrical flair that I will cherish until the day I die, Tiny unspooled a cable as thick as a python, connecting it directly to the surviving emergency breaker on my house, threw a massive metal lever, and hit the ignition. Goliath didn't just start. It exploded into life, letting out a coughing, sputtering roar before settling into a deafening, window-rattling, bone-shaking scream of pure diesel power, a relentless, mechanical thrum that sent a flock of terrified birds scattering into the sky and caused Brenda's prize-winning roses to visibly violently vibrate on their stems. Inside my home, the lights blazed back to life with a triumphant surge, and my medical concentrator gave a happy, electronic beep before whirring back into its steady, life-saving rhythm, sending a rush of cool, pure, unlimited oxygen straight into my lungs. And for the first time that morning, I closed my eyes and took a massive, greedy, deeply satisfying breath, the sweet taste of victory and survival flooding my system. But outside, the real war was just beginning, because Brenda Vance was practically sprinting across her lawn, her face a terrifying shade of violently apoplectic purple, waving her arms and screaming so loudly her vocal cords were straining, though her words were entirely swallowed by the thunderous, majestic roar of Goliath. "Arthur, shut that absolute abomination off right now," she shrieked, finally closing the distance, looking like she was about to physically attack the generator with her bare hands, completely ignoring the fact that I was actively receiving medical treatment thanks to the very machine she was demanding I silence. I calmly reached down, picked up the thick Whispering Pines rulebook from my porch chair, flipped to the beautifully highlighted page containing the emergency clause, and held it up for her to see, my voice steady, amplified by the sheer, undeniable righteousness of my cause as two Naperville police cruisers, their lights flashing brightly, suddenly swerved onto the street and screeched to a halt right behind the flatbed, completely blocking traffic, setting the stage for the most spectacular legal showdown in the history of suburban America. The two officers, a weary, gray-haired veteran named Officer Bradley and his younger, visibly bewildered partner, Officer Jensen, stepped out of their vehicles and immediately covered their ears, staring in absolute awe at the towering yellow monstrosity currently turning the neighborhood into an industrial work zone. Brenda, sensing an opportunity to weaponize local law enforcement, instantly pivoted, sprinting toward the cops and immediately launching into a frantic, hysterical tirade, pointing an accusatory, trembling finger at me while screaming about noise ordinances, property values, and the horrific aesthetic degradation of the community, painting herself as the ultimate victim of a rogue homeowner's psychological warfare. But Officer Bradley, who looked like a man who had dealt with far too many neighborhood tyrants in his long career, simply held up a stern, gloved hand to silence her frantic yapping, walking slowly over to my porch, his eyes carefully assessing my oxygen tank, the severed electrical box dangling pathetically from the side of my house, and the massive, temporary lifeline pulsing with power in the driveway. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked loudly, cutting straight to the heart of the matter, completely ignoring Brenda's incessant, buzzing complaints about my lawn gnome, Barnaby, who was currently sitting peacefully inside my living room. I looked the officer dead in the eye, drawing a deep, steadying breath of clean oxygen, and explained, in excruciatingly polite, devastatingly clear terms, exactly how the woman standing 3 feet away from him had unilaterally decided to use industrial wire cutters to sever the main power line to a house containing life support equipment, casually tossing the heavy metal shears back into her pocket like a petty vandal, all over an imaginary property line dispute regarding a piece of clay. I watched the exact moment the color completely drained from Brenda Vance's face, her arrogant, self-righteous veneer cracking wide open as Officer Jensen's hand instinctively moved toward his radio, the older cop turning to her with a look of absolute, stone-cold fury that sent a shiver of terror down her spine. "Ma'am, did you intentionally sever the utility lines to this man's residence knowing he required electrical medical equipment?" Bradley demanded, his voice slicing through the noise like a razor blade, instantly shutting down her frantic attempts to quote HOA bylaws, firmly informing her that she wasn't just facing a fine, but severe, potential felony charges for reckless endangerment, destruction of private property, and tampering with public utilities. leaving her gaping like a landed fish as a white city inspection truck, driven by a stern-faced official named Inspector Sterling, pulled up to join the circus. Before Brenda could even attempt to lie her way out of the legal bear trap she had so gleefully stepped into, Mac emerged from the truck holding a beautifully organized binder filled with stamped city permits, emergency noise waivers, and medical necessity declarations, handing them smoothly to Inspector Sterling, who reviewed the documents, glanced at the severed power box, and officially ruled that Goliath was entirely legally protected under the city's critical health provisions, meaning the deafening, house-shaking roar was going to continue indefinitely until my power was fully restored, legally immune to any HOA meddling. The sheer, poetic justice of the moment was intoxicating. Brenda was forced to slink back to her house in absolute, humiliated defeat, completely powerless, as the neighborhood, many of whom had been secretly terrorized by her petty tyranny for years, began to subtly emerge from their homes, offering me quiet nods of solidarity, thumbs up, and knowing smiles. While an emergency electrician from Sparks and Wire by Stella, a brilliant, punk rock woman named Stella, arrived to survey the catastrophic damage, informing me that the repairs would take the entire night, meaning Goliath was going to sing its thunderous, beautiful song of vengeance until the sun came up. And roar it did, all through the night. The 40-ton beast shook the foundations of Cypress Court, vibrating the china in Brenda's cabinets and ensuring she didn't get a single, solitary wink of sleep, a relentless, mechanical reminder that actions have deeply profound, inescapable consequences. By the time the sun rose and Stella finally flipped the main breaker, restoring quiet, permanent power to my home and allowing Mac to pack up the glorious yellow Titan, the landscape of the neighborhood had permanently shifted. Brenda Vance, facing the looming threat of massive personal lawsuits and an incredibly hostile, newly emboldened community, abruptly resigned from the HOA board in disgrace, quietly listing her home for sale less than a month later and vanishing from our lives, leaving behind a neighborhood that had finally remembered how to breathe. I sit on my porch now, breathing easily, watching my granddaughter Lily play in the yard while Barnaby the gnome sits proudly in his rightful spot by the roses. And while the piece is beautiful, it leaves a lingering, heavy question hanging in the quiet suburban air. In a world where tiny, petty people are constantly given just enough power to make the lives of others a living hell, is it morally justifiable to unleash absolute, disproportionate chaos to tear down their little kingdoms, or are we simply becoming the very monsters we are fighting to destroy?
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.